I was having supper with my wife's parents when I heard something extraordinary. Get out, you uneducated poor person. It was an insult to my sister, whom I had brought up as if she were my own child. My mother-in-law was spilling coffee on my sister when I hurried into the room because I couldn't stand it any longer. What are you doing? I objected. The icy response from my mother-in-law was, "We are elites. It is embarrassing to have someone in the family who only completed high school. You realize that you should also cut her off. If not, your spouse will lose his job." My mother-in-law scowled as I stated that, and she went pale with amazement when the truth set in. Mike Miller is my name. My age is 35. I began working immediately after high school and currently serve as the chairman of a corporate group that employs 2,000 people. You might imagine someone sitting in an opulent office when you hear the word chairman, but that's not me. I try to visit as many subsidiaries as I can each day, hear what the staff members have to say, and assist them with any problems they may be having. I'm also responsible for putting the different suggestions made by the staff into practice. Despite my hectic schedule, I always make time to visit one particular grocery once a week. Hey Susan, looks like you're doing well. Oh brother, hurry up. You don't have to come every week, as I keep telling you, Susan said. Susan, my sister, is employed at this grocery store. She is currently 22 years old. Despite our considerable age difference, we are incredibly close. Susan began living alone at the age of 20. I frequently visit this supermarket to see how she is doing because I'm worried about her. I would come every day if I could, but she gets upset, so I just go once a week. I was still in high school when our parents died one after the other. Susan was still a small child at the time, so it's likely that she doesn't remember much of them. Our father's mother, our grandmother, reared us. When I became 20, that grandmother also died of disease. Then my sister and I were the only two members of the family left. I have loved and raised Susan for the last 10 or so years, promising to keep my only family safe. Susan declared she didn't want to attend high school while she was in the 9th grade. She said to me, "I don't want to burden you anymore, brother." I was against it, of course. Despite my assurances that I would work hard to pay for her tuition, Susan refused to change her mind and chose not to attend high school. Susan started working part-time at a nearby supermarket, and she still works there today. I regretted not being able to send Susan to high school. If I had made more money, she wouldn't have had to give up on going to high school. I wanted to give Susan at least a little better life. That's why, at 20, I decided to start my own business. The company did well, and as it gradually expanded, it led to where we are now. I was very grateful to my grandmother, who had showered us with love in place of our parents. I wanted to help people like my grandmother. After gaining practical experience working at a senior care facility, I took a training course and got my caregiver certification. I found fulfillment in caregiving, so I chose to go into the caregiving business. I renovated my home and started a daycare service. Maybe my grandmother in heaven was watching over me because the business went very well. But there are also people who can't come to the daycare. For those people, I started home care services. As I continued my work, many people joined me, not only caregivers, but also nurses, physical therapists, supportive lawyers, tax accountants, and many others. At such times, I remember what my grandmother used to say. There are all kinds of people in the world, but since we are human, everyone has a few flaws, right? There's no one without flaws, but I don't think there's anyone who doesn't have some good points. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. So Mike, you should live your life seeing the good in people. I think that will definitely make your life richer. Just as my grandmother said, I have lived by seeing the good in people, and I believe my life has become richer because of it. Nowadays, not only do I support people who provide home care, but I have also established group homes and special nursing homes, making my company a corporate group. So I'm the chairman there, but the most important thing, I think, is the smiles of the elderly. That's why I still visit the facilities and help with home care. The smiles of the elderly give me energy. Of course, Susan's smile too. Your work is amazing, brother. I really respect you, Susan often said. But about a year ago, she brought up a serious topic. I'm really grateful to you, brother, But I'm 21 now. I'm an adult, right? Don't worry about me. Focus on your own happiness. Actually, I've been dating a woman for a few years now. Her name is Margaret Jones. She's 2 years younger than me and works as a doctor. She works at a hospital near the care facility and regularly comes for checkups. It didn't take long for me to fall for Margaret, who always smiled and treated the people at the facility with great kindness. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confess. I never felt ashamed of my high school education. I believe a person's worth isn't determined by their academic background, but the difference in education between Margaret and me did bother me. I wondered how Margaret, with her high education, saw me. It made me hesitant. However, Margaret easily overcame the wall I had built. I really love seeing your kind smile when you interact with the elderly, Mike. At that moment, Margaret became just as important to me as Susan. Susan knew I was dating Margaret, and she probably encouraged me to propose since I was hesitating. Brother, if you can't take care of your own life, how can you take care of someone else's? The day after Susan said that, I proposed to Margaret. Margaret, well, she said, it's about time, and accepted. We decided to get married. Since we were both busy, we only took wedding photos. Margaret's parents seemed a bit dissatisfied, but it was Margaret who suggested we keep it simple. I don't like big ceremonies, Margaret said, but I also thought she might be considering my feelings. For our wedding, Margaret would have many relatives attending, but on my side, it would just be Susan. Maybe she worried that Susan and I would feel out of place. Anyway, we got married, and now, in our first year of marriage, we're happily living together. One day, Susan contacted me with the news. I became a full-time employee. Susan, who worked diligently, was trusted by the supermarket manager. The manager had repeatedly recommended Susan for full-time status from her part-time position to the headquarters. However, it was rejected every time. The reason was Susan's educational background. They said they couldn't make someone with just a high school diploma a full-time employee. When I heard that, I deeply regretted not forcing her to continue her education back then. I then asked Susan if she wanted to join my company. There are various companies within the corporate group, and even though she only has a high school diploma, Susan is diligent and learns quickly. There would be plenty of jobs for her. I even thought about suggesting that she go to school now to get qualifications as a nurse or caregiver, but Susan turned down all these suggestions. If I go to school, you'd have to pay for my tuition, right? Even though I told her that the tuition wouldn't be a significant burden for me now, Susan didn't budge. She also refused to join my company. I finally got used to living alone, and things are going well. I don't want to change my current life. Besides, I don't want a job through connections. As the chairman's sister, people would be overly considerate. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone. I didn't think anyone at my company would give Susan special treatment, but her resolve was firm, and I couldn't change her mind. 2 years passed after that. The manager didn't give up and kept appealing to headquarters repeatedly. And finally, Susan became a full-time employee. Susan's voice was full of joy when she told me the news. When I told Margaret, she was just as happy as if it were her own achievement. We need to celebrate. Let's book a nice restaurant. I'll ask Susan what she wants to eat. Margaret immediately took out her phone and called Susan. Margaret and Susan get along well. They had met a few times before we got married, but after our marriage, Margaret frequently called Susan and kept in touch via line. Susan, who works at the supermarket, often has weekdays off, and when Margaret's days off matched, they would go out together. I could take time off whenever I wanted, so I once suggested joining them. We're having a girls' day, so don't come, Mike. Yeah, brother, you're just in the way, they both said, turning me down. They're having fun without me, I grumbled, but deep down, I was really happy. No matter how close we are, I'm a guy and much older, so it's hard to understand Susan's feelings completely. But Margaret and Susan are both women. Moreover, Margaret is kind, bright, and straightforward, so Susan quickly warmed up to her. Watching Margaret and Susan, who seemed like sisters, made me happy as well. What? Really? Are you sure about that? Okay, I'll prepare. Margaret, who had been talking cheerfully with Susan, hung up the phone. "What does Susan want to eat?" I asked. Margaret looked a bit awkward. "She wants to come over to our place instead of going out." My surprise had a reason. Margaret, who seemed flawless in every way, had one shortcoming. She was terrible at cooking. Not just cooking. She was generally bad at housework. Her cooking was awful. It was astonishing how she managed to create dishes that were unbelievably, uniquely bad. I once asked her about her mother. Her response was, "My mother doesn't do housework." Margaret's mother ran an imported goods store and was always busy with work, so all the housework was left to their housekeeper. I think it's just an excuse. "My mom is really bad at housework too," Margaret said in a sarcastic tone. It was unusual, making me think she didn't get along well with her mother. Usually girls learn housework from their mothers, but a housekeeper wouldn't teach that. Margaret's mother was very focused on education, so Margaret spent her childhood going to cram schools and having private tutors, leaving no time for housework. Thanks to that, I got into medical school straight away, so I'm grateful for that, she said. After leaving home and living alone, she managed to handle cleaning and laundry, but cooking was still a struggle. As for me, I could do all the housework. After my grandmother passed away, I had no choice but to do it myself. Currently, Margaret and I share the housework. She does the laundry, I cook, and we both clean. I learned cooking from my grandmother, so I'm quite good at it. However, since my grandmother taught me, I can't cook modern dishes. I can't make fancy party food either. Dishes like meat and potatoes or grilled fish wouldn't really feel like a celebration. "Well, Susan said she'd like delivery pizza," Margaret said with a wry smile. According to Susan, she had always wanted to eat delivery pizza, but felt awkward ordering it for just one person. With 3 people, they could order many different kinds, which sounded perfect to her. Susan was being considerate of me. Susan obviously knew that Margaret wasn't good at cooking. While it might have been easier to go out to eat, Susan didn't like spending our money. The best way to avoid spending too much and not burdening Margaret with cooking was to have delivery pizza at home. "Susan is such a good girl," Margaret said with deep feeling, and I nodded in agreement. Then, on the day of the celebration, Margaret and I eagerly ordered several kinds of pizza. "Can we really eat all this?" Susan looked a bit overwhelmed, but happily reached for each type of pizza. We also opened a special bottle of champagne and had cakes from Margaret's favorite bakery for dessert. The 3 of us had a wonderful time together. At the end of that enjoyable evening, Margaret started to speak, looking quite uncomfortable. "Hey, I got a call from my mom yesterday." At those words, Susan stiffened. Susan had never met Margaret's parents for various reasons. "My mom invited us to dinner. She said it was for me and Mike." Before Margaret could finish, Susan interrupted, "It's okay, sis. I know I'm not liked, so don't worry about it." Margaret responded, "That's not it." She thought this would be a great opportunity now that Susan had become a full-time employee. When her mom, Lisa, extended the invitation, Margaret mentioned Susan's new job and said she wanted to bring her along. Surprisingly, Lisa agreed. Susan looked worried and asked, "Is it really okay?" I was also concerned, but I knew we couldn't keep Susan from meeting them forever. Susan is a good person. Once they meet her, they'll understand, Margaret said. Her words gave me the courage to proceed. If Susan had to meet them eventually, now might indeed be the best time. "Susan, let's go together." "Don't worry. No matter what happens, I'll protect you." Hearing this, Susan burst out laughing. "You're being dramatic, brother. I'll protect you too," she said. Margaret added seriously, "I'll protect you both," making me realize that visiting the Jones family might be quite challenging. On the day of the invitation, we arrived at the Jones house just after 4:00 p.m., as Lisa had instructed. It seemed early for a dinner invitation, but that was the time she specified. When the door opened, only Lisa was there. Margaret's father, Daniel, was still at work. Daniel's absence made me a bit uneasy. "Nice to meet you. I'm Mike's sister, Susan," Susan said, smiling at the entrance. But Lisa only gave a slight nod and didn't return the greeting. Margaret scolded her mom. "That's rude." But Lisa pretended not to hear. I even thought about leaving right then, but Susan whispered, I'm okay, so I decided to endure it for now. When we were shown into the living room, Lisa served us coffee. That's unusual, Margaret remarked. Lisa had explained that the housekeeper had suddenly taken a day off. Dinner is catered, so that's fine, but there are still some things missing. Margaret, could you go buy them? Lisa handed Margaret a shopping list, and I was surprised by its length. Let's see, 3 bottles of wine, prosciutto, melon, smoked salmon, all this. As expected, the list contained a lot of items. Make sure to shop at the usual supermarket. Thanks, Lisa said calmly. It was definitely more than Margaret could carry alone. The best solution was for me to go with her to help carry the items, but I hesitated. If Margaret and I went shopping, it would leave Susan alone with Lisa. Susan noticed my hesitation. It'll be tough for Margaret to carry all that by herself. Brother, you should go with her. Even then, I couldn't agree right away. I'm not a child anymore. I can handle being left alone for a while, Susan said. Those words made me get up. Margaret and I left the house and headed to the high-end supermarket Lisa favored. After walking for about 5 minutes, Margaret suddenly exclaimed, "Oh," and realized she had forgotten her wallet. Unfortunately, I had also left my bag at the Jones house. We have no choice but to go back and get it. We returned to the Jones house. Margaret had the front door key, so we went straight to the living room. As we approached the door, we overheard a conversation. "Get out, you uneducated poor person." Margaret and I exchanged glances. Uneducated poor person? Those words were directed at Susan. I opened the door and rushed into the living room. At that moment, I heard Susan's small scream. Lisa was pouring coffee over Susan's head. "What are you doing?" I burst into the living room and stood between Susan and Lisa. "Susan." Margaret rushed in and hugged Susan. "I'm so sorry, Susan." "I'm so sorry." Margaret apologized in a tearful voice, wiping the coffee off Susan with a towel. "Margaret, there's no need to apologize to an uneducated poor person," Lisa said. Those words made both Margaret and me glare at Lisa, but Lisa wasn't intimidated. "You know very well we are an elite family. It's hard enough to accept you with just a high school diploma, but someone who didn't even finish high school? Impossible. And a part-time worker at a supermarket? I told you she became a full-time employee recently." Margaret's rebuttal fell on deaf ears. "Even so, it's still a supermarket, right? She's still poor anyway. Having someone who didn't finish high school in the family isn't embarrassing. You must feel the same, right?" "Of course not. Spare me the pretty words." Lisa cut me off and started speaking at length. "Everyone in our family is highly educated. At the very least, they have a bachelor's degree. Many have even gone on to graduate school. A lack of education means a lack of culture. It means being an uncultured, inferior person." Susan started trembling. "Susan, you're all wet from the coffee. Let's go to the bathroom and take a shower. I'll get you some clothes." Margaret was clearly trying to prevent Susan from hearing more of Lisa's words, but Susan shook her head and wouldn't leave. "I cannot accept this person as a member of my family. Mike, you are barely acceptable with just a high school diploma, but someone who didn't finish high school? Absolutely not, especially a part-time worker at a supermarket. Susan is my precious sister. I could never cut ties with her." At that moment, Susan slowly stood up. "Brother Margaret, it's okay to cut ties with me." I stared at Susan in shock at her unexpected words. She had a look of resignation in her eyes and even a faint smile. I guess I was never meant to be happy. Margaret also looked shocked, but it seemed like Susan couldn't see anyone anymore. Because it was my fault, wasn't it? I'm the one who took Mom's life and left you all alone. Susan, as you can tell by the age difference between me and Susan, our mother had her at a rather advanced age. She wasn't a very strong person, and the doctors had told her that giving birth could be life-threatening. But our mother chose to have Susan without hesitation. Susan was born safely, but our mother passed away. It was heartbreaking, but I can say this for sure. Neither my father nor I ever thought, if only Susan weren't here. She was the precious daughter and sister our mother gave her life for. We never told Susan the real reason our mother died. We had told her that she died of an illness shortly after Susan was born. I don't know how Susan found out the truth, but it must have caused her a lot of pain. I gritted my teeth, realizing I hadn't noticed her suffering. If I wasn't here, Mom wouldn't have gone to heaven. If Mom were here, Dad wouldn't have collapsed from overwork, and Grandma wouldn't have. No, Susan, it's not your fault. You did nothing wrong. I instinctively hugged Susan. You are my precious, precious sister. Because of you, I've been able to keep going. I'm happy now because of you, so don't ever say you shouldn't be happy. That's right, Susan. You're my precious sister too. You deserve to be happy. Margaret soothed Susan gently, rubbing her back. Brother, if you hug me so tightly, you'll get dirty from the coffee. I don't care. I hugged her even tighter, and Susan burst into tears. Lisa watched us as if she were seeing something strange. Could she not understand Susan's pain? After a while, Susan looked up at me, her face a little embarrassed but smiling. Thank you, brother. I signaled to Margaret with my eyes. Margaret immediately understood and led Susan out of the living room. Now, I faced Lisa. I could never forgive her for making Susan so sad. So, you're saying you want to cut ties with Susan? Of course, Lisa replied confidently. Understood. Then your husband is fired. Lisa looked puzzled, not understanding what I meant. Cutting ties with Susan means cutting ties with me as well. So your husband is fired. What do you mean? What does my husband have to do with you? Seeing her confusion, I explained. A year ago, Daniel, my father-in-law, had been laid off from his previous job. The reason for the layoff was frequent absences and early leaves. However, Daniel wasn't slacking off. He was taking care of his mother, who was Margaret's grandmother. When his mother fell ill, Daniel had asked Lisa to help with the caregiving, but Lisa refused, saying, "She's your mother. Why should I have to take care of her?" So Daniel had to frequently take time off from work to arrange for his mother to be admitted to a facility or to take her to the hospital. As a result, he became a candidate for downsizing. I found out because the facility his mother entered was part of my corporate group. I wanted to help Daniel, who was still trying to take care of his mother despite being laid off, so I hired Daniel at one of my group companies. However, I kept my involvement a secret. Therefore, Daniel didn't realize that the company he now worked for was part of my group. Lisa didn't even know he had been laid off. In other words, I was Daniel's employer. I could fire him if I wanted to. When I explained this, Lisa turned pale. Please forgive me. I didn't know. Forget about your sister, just don't fire my husband. What do you mean by forget about her? I couldn't forgive her for belittling Susan and trying to brush it off with a simple apology. Well, even if she didn't finish high school, she's still your sister. I'll accept her as part of our family. Accept her? Lisa nodded, but she still didn't understand the fundamental issue. Lisa had opposed our marriage because I had only had a high school diploma. Margaret had told me that Lisa was fixated on academic credentials, but I had been optimistic, thinking she would understand once she got to know me. However, Lisa's obsession with academic achievements was beyond what I had imagined. Only a high school graduate? That's unacceptable as a human being. She refused to even meet me at first. By the way, Lisa herself graduated from an exclusive private women's college. Her husband, Daniel, graduated from a national university. Margaret's brother graduated from graduate school and is now a bureaucrat. And of course, Margaret graduated from medical school. Valisa, having someone with only a high school diploma in the family was shocking. Academic background doesn't matter. Mike is a wonderful person. He had to give up going to college because of family circumstances, and his high school grades were top tier. Margaret tried her best to meet her expectations, but Lisa wouldn't listen. Margaret got so angry that she said, "Fine, I'll cut ties with the Jones family." I suggested that she calm down. I was determined to marry Margaret. That decision hadn't changed. However, I didn't want Margaret to cut ties with her family because of it. My family now consisted of only Susan. My parents and grandmother were no longer with us. Life is unpredictable. You never know how long you'll have your family with you, So I believe that one shouldn't cut ties with family voluntarily. When I explained this to Margaret, she calmed down a bit and said, "I'll talk to Dad." Fortunately, Daniel wasn't as obsessed with academic credentials as Lisa was. He persuaded Lisa, saying, "Don't reject him outright. At least meet him first." Thus, I went to the Jones house to introduce myself. At first, Lisa wouldn't even look me in the eye. It's an unimaginable insult to invite someone with only a high school diploma into this house. "Mom, stop it," Margaret scolded her, but Lisa ignored it completely. At that moment, Daniel asked me about my high school. When I mentioned the name, Lisa's eyes widened. That's a famous prep school. Dozens of students get into Tokyo University every year. Mike was one of the top students in that school, Margaret added. I scratched my head. I had mentioned that to Margaret before, but I didn't expect her to bring it up here. It's true. I was in the advanced class and among the top 5 students. When I said I wasn't going to college, my teacher was surprised and repeatedly urged me to reconsider. Honestly, I had second thoughts, but to me, taking care of my grandmother and Susan was more important than going to college. "Why didn't you go to college?" Lisa pressed me for an explanation, but I wasn't in the mood to go into detail. The reason? Well, it's in the past now, so let's leave it at that. I didn't go to college, but I'm satisfied with my current life and have no regrets. When Margaret told her that I am now the chair of a well-known corporate group, Lisa's attitude softened a bit. "I'll consider whether to allow your marriage to Margaret." At that time, she postponed the decision, but thanks to Daniel's continued persuasion, we eventually got her approval for the marriage. However, we couldn't introduce Susan before the wedding. I wanted Lisa to meet Susan before we got married, but Daniel advised against it. He said that if Lisa found out about Susan before the wedding, she might call off the marriage. So we only told Lisa about Susan after we were officially married. "What? Your sister didn't finish high school and she's working part-time at a supermarket? What is this? You deceived me." Lisa was furious. If I hadn't known about such a sister, I would never have approved this marriage. Lisa was furious, and we were banned from visiting the Jones house for a while. The ban was lifted a few months ago. Daniel seemed to have mediated for us. Still, we couldn't bring Susan to visit. Margaret felt terrible about it and invited Susan today, but Lisa didn't appreciate Margaret's gesture. Even at this point, Lisa saying, "I'll accept her," was something I couldn't forgive. Just as I was about to tell her that, I remembered my grandma's words. Always look for the good in people, so I decided to give her one more chance. "Can you apologize to Susan, my sister? If you sincerely apologize, I might reconsider about your husband." Lisa raised her eyebrows. "Me apologize? You want me to apologize to someone who didn't finish high school? Why should I have to do such a thing?" The moment I heard those words, I realized it was impossible. I couldn't forgive her. Understood. "Then your husband will be fired. If you fire my husband, you will cut ties with this family. You will divorce Margaret." I was stunned. Why was she bringing up divorce? Margaret is not her property. Without even considering Margaret's feelings, she was talking about divorce. Who's being unreasonable here? Don't be ridiculous. Just as I was about to say that, a voice came from behind. "I won't get a divorce. The one cutting ties here isn't Mike. It's the Jones family." Margaret had returned without us noticing and spoke firmly. "I'm never coming back to this house." Lisa was flustered by Margaret's declaration. "Margaret, what are you saying? Are you abandoning your father and me?" Despite Lisa's desperate words, Margaret remained resolute. "I've been sick of your obsession with academic credentials for a long time, but you're my parent, so I hoped you would change someday. But I've reached my limit." Margaret put her arm around Susan's shoulder. After taking a shower, Susan was now clean and dressed in Margaret's borrowed clothes. "You're no longer my family, Mom. My family is now Dad, Mike, and Susan." With Margaret's declaration of separation, Lisa collapsed as if her strength had left her. Margaret didn't look back at Lisa. "Let's go home. Mike?" "Susan." Prompted by Margaret, we left the Jones house. A few days later, Daniel came to my house. He said he had heard everything from Lisa, Although I had said those things to Lisa in the heat of the moment, I had no intention of firing Daniel. Daniel, who had cared for his mother, was kind to the elderly and a very capable employee. I had no plans to let him go. Before I could say anything, Daniel sincerely apologized. "I apologize for my wife's rudeness to Susan," he said. He also said he understood if I decided to fire him. I grew even more fond of Daniel for his integrity. "Firing you is out of the question. Please continue to work with us. You're a valuable asset to our team." Hearing this, Daniel repeatedly thanked me, saying, "Thank you," over and over. He then told me he intended to divorce Lisa. He had been considering it ever since she refused to help care for his mother. Hearing about how she treated Susan had solidified his decision. Lisa was terribly flustered when confronted with the prospect of divorce. Her import goods store, which she managed more as a hobby, had been running at a loss for some time. Daniel had been covering those losses, so if they divorced, the store would undoubtedly go under. "That's her own fault," Daniel said with a wry smile. Although Margaret cut ties with Lisa, she intended to maintain a good relationship with Daniel. Margaret and Susan remained close. Watching Margaret and Susan happily together, I resolved once again to protect these two no matter what. For that, I had to work even harder. Not just for them. I vow to continue my work for the elderly who need care, and to ease the burden on their families as much as possible.